We're looking at the RESTful API in today's lesson, and it's part of the series of 18 that make up the developer program. In today's lesson, we're going to be looking at the idea of the REST API. So we'll be looking at how that operates within the context of Sage CRM. We'll look at how it's integrated into the security model, how we work with data for selecting information, understanding the scope of the API, so the data available to us, and being able to look at how we carry out data tasks, so the creation, reading, update and deletion of data. We'll also consider performance in that, and we'll look at the way in which query fragments can be used when working with the API as well. Let's put the whole of the API into context of Sage CRM and its interactions with other web-based applications. We use the REST API internally for a lot of our own interactions, calling back for some of the AJAX functions that we have within outside Sage CRM, and we also use it for some of the interactions with external applications as well. It's used extensively for integrations with some of the partner third-party integrations between accounting packages and other back-office systems, bringing data into Sage CRM. And it's able to be used because it offers the full ability to insert, update and delete data governed by the territory and other security profile rules set within Sage CRM. We'll find that it's actually a very different API from the API that we were looking at last week, which was the SOAP-based web services. It's a different design philosophy. It's a different as well experience when it comes to actually starting to program with this and using this. This is something that we really have to be able to manage much more in terms of how we structure our web requests. We'll find, though, that there's a lot of things that are very much in parallel. We talked about the idea of schema discovery, the idea of understanding what the available objects were within the SOAP API. That was the idea of the WSDL, the Web Services Description Layer or language, and then in context of the REST API, we'll be looking at the prototypes that we can see to be able to understand all of the objects that are available to us. And one of the things that we have to understand is that whereas SOAP API was going directly into the eWare DLL, the ISAPI extension, anything that comes through the REST API is actually directed into the Java side of Sage CRM. So that's going into redirected from the IIS through to Tomcat, Apache Tomcat, and through to the web apps there. And it's very much within the family of behavior associated with the things like the interactive dashboard, things like the ability to import and import spreadsheets and things like that. So these tasks which are carried out through the Java side of the application have a very similar understanding of how it carries out database interactions and how business rules are also carried out as well. The REST API in its fullness covers more than we are going to be looking at in today's session. We will be looking at chiefly the operational side of things. So we'll be looking at the batch processing, and we'll be looking at the idea of insert, update and delete. We'll be looking at the standard ways in which we can carry out tasks. But in fact, the API encompasses a lot of abilities has endpoints available to us to be able to check user preferences, to be able to look at information around the alerts that are due for a particular user, and understanding what favorites a particular user may have as well. So there's a lot that is similar to the idea of schema discovery and metadata discovery that we're not going to cover in today's session, but there are examples available to us to use within some of the resources that are available. And I'll be explaining about that as we go through and talk about the core data manipulation tasks that we're going to be dealing with now. So where do we get hold of documentation? Most of the sessions today, in this series of 18 lessons, I've been directing you first and foremost to help.sagecrm.com. This is somewhat different because the REST API is actually one of the standard APIs for Sage. It is documented within developer.sage.com, and so that's where you'd head off to, and you can find there in amongst the medium-sized business, medium business solutions alongside Sage 200s, X3 and Intact, you'll find the information for the developer resources, the API reference there. So developer.sage.com, look down to the particular version that you're interested in working with. There are slight differences in the API depending on the supported version that you're using, but what I'm covering here is 2023 R2. You've got the ability to go into the particular versions, but there's also a common get started with the REST API, and that explains some of the common settings and limitations of the API and some of the considerations about how paths are built and how other settings are used. It pays you to look at this because it will allow you to make sure that you're comfortable with the environment that you're going to be testing the API and how you will then go on to make sure that you've got everything that you need in order to be able to carry out the tasks that you want with the API. Now, I'm not making any decisions here. I'm not making any recommendations about the development environment that you'd be using. I'll come on, though, to look at how example code is built in a moment. But there are quite a few examples of problem solving up on the Sage Community Hub. So if you have a look at Sage City for that, you'll find in the hints, tips and tricks blogs articles on the usage of the REST API and some of the techniques that you can use to solve issues. Within the support of that, you can see as well that the YouTube channel has got a set of REST API based videos. They will be able to be an additional resource for you to revise some of the concepts that we've looked at here as well. But the chief resource for learning Sage CRM and the REST API will actually be the Postman collections that we've made available. So inside the documentation, there are links to allow you to click and download Postman packages that will be projects that can be unpacked and then used within the context of Postman to be able to demonstrate all of the actions, the different forms of querying that we have, and the different methods in terms of being able to insert data, update data, and delete data from within inside Sage CRM. All of the screen examples, I'll be using these throughout the presentation, and so you can look to those and actually see what the interface is like. Sage CRM can be used with other products. So I've used in the past the advanced REST client, but in fact, probably Postman is the best. If you want to test, actually, you can do a little bit of testing directly from within inside the browser, but really you need to be able to form the headers to be able to pass in the authentication information into CRM. Now, I've managed to talk for 10 minutes already without actually explaining what the REST API is, and here this is where we do need to understand the way in which REST, or representational state transfer, works in the context of Sage CRM. I'm looking now at a Postman screen. Postman is this tool that you can use to test out the API, and you can see that this allows me to pass in a URL. You'll see that there's a particular HTTP verb being used. That verb happens to be a get. We can see that we've got on this screen a username and password being passed in as part of the basic authentication for Sage CRM, so that there's an element of the security side here, so that there is basic encoded information sent. And we can see that there is a result that has been handed back in the form of JSON, JavaScript object notation format, has been returned. And you can see as well that there is a code to indicate that this has worked correctly, and that an HTTP response code of 200 has been provided. So that's all within this particular example. So we know that this is going to be about the REST API works on the basis that there's a URL, it makes an HTTP request, it handles an HTTP response, that error codes are important, and that we also have to make use of headers to be able to pass information into CRM. If we look at the usage of the verb, this implies certain behavior. So there are different verbs in terms of HTTP. You're either going to, typically if you're using a browser, you're always going to be using a get. But when you come to carrying out an action within an HTML form, very often that's a post. For example, in the CRM interface, we send data back to the server in a form by posting it. The Sage CRM REST API uses post for a very particular purpose, which is to create data or insert data into the system. But if you're looking at existing data and you're modifying it, then we use the verb patch as the differentiator there. So we use these verbs, and I think there are 7 verbs in total for HTTP, but we're just concentrating on 4 of these: the get, patch, post, and delete. And this has the implied data interaction inside CRM. And explicitly, we can see this in terms of the corresponding SQL behavior as well. So when we're doing a post, we'll be inserting, and when we're doing a patch, we'll be doing an update. When we're doing a get, we're doing a select, and when we're doing a delete, we're doing an SQL delete. Those actions are then associated with the full path. So if we just concentrate on the get, we think about the way in which the endpoint is structured. So a REST URL is going to have the idea of a host and a port. It's then going to have the context, the type of resource that we're accessing, very often called the noun, because we've got the verb in the sentence, that's the get, perhaps, and then the noun is going to be the company, perhaps, and then we've got the specifier, which says, well, it provides the indication as to which particular company or record or whatever we're interested in getting. So all the others start to build up the path to what we're interested in. So in our case, the server, the host and port, is whether we are talking over HTTP or HTTPS, and I'll be coming on to talk about recommendations in a moment. But when it comes to the host and port and the context part, we're going down there and saying that we're talking to the SData endpoint, we're talking to the particular instance of CRM, and we're then talking to the REST API, which uses the Sage CRM 2 URL fragment. Then we have inside that the resource being accessed, the company, with the unique identifier being passed as the specifier. Now the specifier can actually be skipped, and instead we use other forms of path fragment to do that, and we will see that a little bit later on. But right now we can think about how that ties into security, because if we're requesting something like a company, we have to make sure that the account that is being used has the rights to be able to see a company or that particular company. So any interaction with the REST API, and here you can see I've started to create a Windows application, writing in C#, how we would go about building a web request. And you can see that I'm building my web request and adding in the authorization headers to this. So you can see that I've provided base64 encoding onto the string, and that together will provide the basic authentication to be able to connect in the message in the header to carry out the work that I want. Now, you have to use a user within inside Sage CRM to carry out the tasks that you want to do. And that user is going to be governed by security, all of the security policies that we're going to face. But because you're passing in credentials, each request that you're making, it's recommended that you only do this over an HTTPS secure connection. So don't use the REST API over a general HTTP connection. Only do this over HTTPS, because we want to make sure that we're not vulnerable to man-in-the-middle attacks or any other listening attacks on our server. When it comes to the request, individual users can use the REST API. It is switched on and enabled for all users because we're using it internally within Sage CRM. It's implied that it's used straight away, and the individual users authenticate using their username and passwords. But the fact that they belong to different teams, they belong to different security profiles, will all apply and will be taken into account as to what data they can see and which actions they can perform. So They may be restricted on the selection that they can make. They will also be restricted on which entities they can insert, update, or delete from as well. And all of the actions, especially the deletes, for example, follow the rules of soft deletion that Sage CRM has, and any of the interactions that the API makes with ultimately the database, all of the created by and updated by and the created date and the updated date settings will all be updated as we carry out work through the RESTful API. Now, our credentials have been supplied, and those credentials are used when the request is made, and that determines what the user can access. When it comes to dealing with writing our code, then we have to think about which user we're going to use in order to carry out the actions. And you may want to give this some thought if you're designing an application where perhaps you are using the REST API to integrate a corporate website with Sage CRM and wanting to carry out when an action occurs inside the corporate website to push information through into CRM. You might want to think about whether you've got a dedicated account for that purpose. But it will have to have sufficient rights to be able to do the job that you want. And by default, for example, if you're doing work, it will know and it will be aware as to which territory, for example, that you're in. Now, that idea of the territory rights especially comes into play when we're retrieving information, when we're getting hold of this, and the REST-based interface is controlled by the security profiles. So you're not going to be ever allowed to see data that you can't see. And in addition to the security profiles, which is really row-based security, the field-based security that when you go into administration customization and you're looking at an entity and looking at the list of fields, the field-based rules also apply. So it might be that some users simply cannot see a particular item of data or access it, but it's not retrieved because that column is not visible to the user. Let's see, though, now how data is handled. This is a REST request. You can see that it has in the URL, it's got the path looking to the company as the noun, and you'll see that it's passing in the specifier of 28. So in brackets, quote, single quote, 28. Single quote. This is Postman again, and we can see that the result has come back in JSON. You can see that it has a set of name value pairs. This is I think is a very accessible way of working with data, better than XML in my opinion, anyway, and it's a very lightweight way of passing the data backwards and forwards. The REST API is less verbose than the SOAP API, and I think it's a more digestible set of data that comes back. When we think about the structure of that JSON message, it's always going to be dealing with essentially 4 basic types. So there's always strings, which are double quoted Unicode, and it's all UTF-8 by default. And if you want to use numbers, you can use escapes. There are Boolean values, true or false, and then there are also null values as well. So numbers, strings, Boolean values, and null are the 4 types of data that we're dealing with here. They're in the form of tuples, so name-value pairs, and what you will be able to see is, and this is a comparison here, is that you can imagine these as JavaScript objects that have been created. Now, the objects have properties, which are these name-value pairs. They're unordered, they are identified by name, and so they're quite easy to be able to use. And if you were handling this in the context of JavaScript or in the context of something that parsed it and turned it into another form of object, then you would be able to handle all of those just simply by rolling through each of the items within inside the object. The objects themselves can nest. So here we can see that sub-objects can be included within the structure. So in this particular case, we'll see in a moment how our objects which return from a real query will, like an opportunity, will have structures internally within it, like a URL, and that URL will be made up of information such as the association as to what this is tied to. So this is the same sense of content pairs. They're separated by commas if you want to have multiple ones, and inside there you can have these additional curly braces, objects within objects being set up. The data that we work with here then allows us to carry out all forms of manipulation, but if we want to be able to carry out a full task against Sage CRM, we have to know what are the objects that we can see, how can we understand the data that we can use. Now, we're in a sort of funny situation in the sense that we can only support what we've tested, and so we say we support these entities because these are the entities that are available to Sage CRM to see. We can't know that we're supporting your custom entities because we can't test your custom entities. We can test ones that we've used, so we know that the REST API is extendable over custom entities, but we can't say formally that we're supporting because we don't know how you've named things, we don't know how you're structuring those elements within inside the system. But what we've got is the knowledge that we can start to see the objects that are available. Now, in this particular case, I might retrieve a URL looking down at a particular opportunity. In this particular case, I'm looking at opportunity 6. That's going to have a result coming back. We know about that. That's the idea of the response that comes back. That will have other objects within it so that there are other relationships defined within one object. Now, this is sort of hard coded in the sense that it's looking at the overall rule set and describes the relationship of the parental object, the opportunity, with other resources as well. This means that we've got here a type of schema discovery, live asking questions of one item of data, and it knows about other data to which it's related. So a company is going to know about its persons. It's going to know about its. It's going to know about any of the addresses associated with it. That is very useful to us, but there's more that we can say about schema discovery, and the main way in which we can discover what is available to us to use is through the prototypes endpoint. So here, this is a service rather than a noun, if you like, an entity. We're requesting prototypes, and this is going to return back to us a listing of all of the resources. So it's describing the different resources available to us. Those resources are the company, the person, the opportunity, the case, etc. The prototype is a read-only endpoint. It's a snapshot in time, so it will only change if the structure of the database changes. It'll change as and when custom entities are added or removed, or columns are added or removed, and you would need to refetch that in order to understand if there had been a change between the request and response of one period of time with the now. So it is not something that is it's constantly refreshable. You can constantly ask questions of it to get the latest information. If we see here, you can see that I've requested the details of an opportunity entity, and that opportunity entity that we can see is revealing then the different children within it, associations within it, allowing us to dig down and potentially see in other information which allows us to hyperlink or link off to other points to ask other questions. If we look at the example of what we can do at this point, I'm going to now use some of the postman behavior, postman examples, to show how we do these different jobs. Remember what we were saying, that we have we're going to be carrying out tasks using the idea of the HTTP verb to determine the behavior that we're invoking. So when we get, we are selecting information from the database. When we choose to put, we're going to be carrying out an insert. When we choose to post or patch, sorry, that should be that we will be carrying out a update. And when we carry out a delete, then that's going to be a deletion task. So let's see the types of queries that we can ask. Here you can see that we can use not just a single identifier, but we can start to get hold of data in ranges. So you've got here a where underscore company ID is in a list of items that you might want to include. We'll see in a moment how we can use a where clause to look at other information that will return a set of data and not just one. And these are all these request patterns that we have. Now, if we want to go down and explore the prototype of an individual structure, an individual resource, then we can do that by saying $prototype / and then the resource that we're interested in. That will itemize all of the columns. If we know the columns that are available to us, and we all know the types of information that is available to us, whether these are Booleans or whether they are going to be strings or numbers, we can then start to request things. So the second example on the screen is showing the type of path that allows us to specify exactly which company we want. If we've looked at the prototype, we've seen what the unique identifier is, or reasoned what the unique identifier is, we can then say, right, give me that record. The company ID range is equally good, but we can also start to say where, and here's my example where I'm choosing to say where the comp underscore type is like customer. Now you'll notice in this particular case, when I'm using a like and I'm using a wildcard, but notice that here I've had to encode it. I've had to use URL encoding to be able to do that. If you're using, this may or may not be true for your implementation, whichever development tool that you're using, but certainly in Postman, properly encoding things is necessary. And that shows you the types of query that you can ask. There are some discussions and explanations of this on Sage City as well, so you can see more information about that. You can also start to restrict information that is returned. So you'll notice in the results set that comes back, you have information about the total number of records found. You've got information here as well about the start index that is being used and the items on each page. Well, that type of parameter information can be used yourself. So you can start to say, well, I want to fetch the next set of information by determining what point within the data set that is returned. And that actually brings me up into a useful point to talk about the types of results that you might be getting. But they fall, for a query, they fall into three broad categories. They fall into either we're dealing with a single entry, that's where we've put the specifier in of the primary identifier, and we're getting back the single company and then the pointers to its associated information, but we're getting essentially back one record. Or we could be getting back a whole set, which is a feed, or we could get an error code that comes back where our request has actually generated something other than a 200 or 201 HTTP code. So a diagnosis is an error, and we'll see this in a moment, but let's just think about a get entry. In my screen, this is where I have used my call to my endpoint, my CRMJ, Sage CRM 2// that's all the details of the contract location, and then company is the noun that I want to use, or the resource that I'm talking to, and then passing in the specifier to retrieve that resource. One company exists with that unique identifier, and so that I get in my result set one record. But if I ask a different question, you can see here that you get the corresponding simpler structure of the JSON object. But if I ask a question that is a little bit more wide, so in this case, if I had completely left out a specifier, or if, as I've done here, said that I'm interested where the comp type equals customer, so those that are directly customers, Then out of, let's say, 1,204 companies in my database, I will get 388 or whatever it is of those type of customers back. But I still get that feed being built that I would then have to handle with pagination. So I have that data coming back to me, and that's a feed. So the object is where there is a list or a set of objects all described within inside JSON. If I make an error, then, when I make an illegal or erroneous request, then I'll get a diagnosis sent back to me. Now, I will get these typically where I have malformed the URL. And in the example that I've used, I've actually said where comp type equals, what have I said here, equals customer, and there are no quotes. So this is not going to be handled correctly because I need to have indicated that this was a string. You'll notice now that that diagnosis comes up, and that's the type of error catch that we see. And it's a 400 error code. And we get, therefore, an understanding of how the API is using these standard HTTP status codes. So the codes represent the results of operations that you perform against the REST service of Sage CRM. So you've either got, the two basic ones that you'll see are in the 200 family or the 400 family. So 200 is everything is okay. I've retrieved the information that you wanted, no problem. And a 201 means that everything is fine and I've managed to insert or update the information that you wanted. A 204, that's where you've updated. It's not quite strict that there's no information provided. There's a flag that we can use to determine whether we want data returned or not. But you can see that if there's an error, it's a 400 or a 401 typically request. So we need to look out for those codes and understand what they are. We can then help us work out where and how the error has happened. If we look at the description of any of the entities inside the documentation, we will find that the full methods for data manipulation are documented. So we can come into developer.sage.com, we can look down to our version of the API, so 2023 R2 perhaps, and we can see here that we can have access to the descriptions of each of the different methods and how we carry out the task of an update, etc. Now, that takes us so far, knowing that, if you like, you've got the fulsome code to describe this, but it's probably easiest to understand what's going on if we go back and think about the postman. And within here, with the postman API development environment, we can start to test things out. This is, for example, an insert. Now, when you carry out an insert, you can see that the HTTP method has been changed to a post. The main security header, the main authentication information will be, or authorization will be the same using the basic authentication. But when we're updating something or we are inserting something, then this is done through a body. So we're having to write our own JSON object to pass the information into the system. In this particular case, if we are creating this, this happens to be a little bit of information for an update, but let's assume that we were carrying out an insert. I wouldn't have included the $key equals 1, but the rest of the information is providing the key information that we need to successfully create our note. We have the note text. You see here we've got the foreign key information to link it in to its parental objects, and when it runs, we can see that it's fine. It creates the record as expected. Now we can actually also carry out batch inserts of data as well. Batch operations are possible as well. So batch inserts and updates and deletes all can be done. You can see that where we are passing a batch in, you actually have to send it to a slightly different endpoint called batch. But the structure then is much the same. This is another post, so we're inserting 2 new items. And it's very useful that this is documented inside the Postman collection, so you can see how this is behaving. We can also see as well how we would go about and carry out another change inside the system. Now you'll notice in this case that it's got a flag associated with it, return partial equals false. Now this is a performance bit of behavior here. Normally, imagine where we are inserting information into the system. It would be a reasonable assumption to say, well, if I've just inserted some information, I know what that information is, and that's the information that I know, so my result doesn't have to be fetched again. I can assume what my result is. So if I'm using this result set for further processing, that's what my result set is. If I put something in and it was an OK message, then I know what the result will be. But there are some circumstances, and that's a performance thing. So that pushes the information in, and that's good, and it does that for performance. But you may actually need to make a decision to retrieve the full information, because if something has happened on the server, so for example, an escalation rule is fired that changes data, or indeed a workflow rule fires on the server as we carry out the insert, then we would need to double check and get the full set of data back. That's why we have this idea of the, as we can see here, the return partial equals false. So that retrieves everything again. We have instead of just 3 columns that we've inserted or updated, it retrieves everything from the result. Now, that adds a little bit of delay into things, but you can understand why that does that. Now here we can look at an update, and you'll notice, please, that this is a patch. So posts are used for our inserts, and patches being used for the updates. When we carry out an update, we can expect a result set back, but when we carry out a delete, we can expect an empty set of data back. And so this is where we're carrying out the deletes. Looks like, make sure that when you're doing with the URL, the idea of a get and a delete, they're only the HTTP verb different, and we wouldn't want to ruin our days by accidentally deleting things. We're very close to the end of what I wanted to cover. We've looked now at the core parts of the API, because we've gone into looking at the main verbs for data manipulation. As I said, there's more to read about, more to look about, everything from how data uploads take place through to how we can interact and retrieve information for interface and labeling purposes from translations. But that's where we've got to in today's session. We are making very good progress through the cycle of training. We're going to be now looking at the concept of self-service over the next couple of lessons. But I wonder, does anyone have any questions? So thank you very much for coming along, everyone. We're going to see you next week, I hope, as we start to discuss self-service. Thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.